As a Final Fantasy fan, I've grown to see Final Fantasy XI as having some of the most iconic moments in the entire series. This game is singled out as being too different from the other entries for Final Fantasy fans to enjoy. I can understand why some would think this, but this couldn't be further from the truth. As a longtime fan of the series and a relatively new 11 player myself, I can honestly say that 11 may be the most Final Fantasy FF game in the series, especially in terms of story and lore. In light of this fact, I'd like to look at some of my favorite references to the series that 11 has. The first is a reference to Vivi from Final Fantasy IX. Vivi is a black mage who must come to terms with the brevity of his own lifespan. The black mages are created by the Kingdom of Alexandria, and they only live for a few years. Throughout the story, Vivi is forced to learn about the meaning of life in light of his impending death. The resulting character arc is one of the most emotionally impactful and philosophically provocative character arcs in the Final Fantasy series. 11 has a huge homage to Vivi in the form of Roble Arkbel. Roble Arkbel resembles Vivi in the black mage design in general. However, his short stature comes from his being a Tarutaru, which is the race most proficient in magic. Many notice this character's resemblance to the black mage design and think the reference stops there. However, his story arc utilizes identical themes found to Vivi's. Roble Arkbel is a warlock warlord from the Federation of Windurst during the time of the Crystal War. He isn't just any military leader though. He is actually one of the few individuals who traveled back in time from a future where Windurst and the Alliance loses the Crystal War. Armed with the knowledge of the future, Roble Arkbel must also come to terms with how best to live his life and lead Windurst through war in light of his impending death. This creates the most morally ambiguous and compelling character development in the entire Final Fantasy franchise. As a player, you have to watch this character you grow to love do some of the worst things imaginable for the sake of saving the world. And you also see the toll this takes on him. This character is truly one of a kind for the Final Fantasy games, and as a huge fan of Vivi, this made this story arc so much better. One important note about the way 11 handles its references to previous Final Fantasy titles is the writers go out of their way to deeply integrate any reference into 11's lore. So while references such as Roble Arkbel can bear a ton of similarities to the thing that they're referencing, their integration into Vana'diel lore is never predictable or contrived. This is true for every other reference in this list, and it's certainly true for Roble Arkbel. He's one of the few characters that not only deliver a great character arc and improve the story he's in, but also make the broader related stories of the game so much better and thematically provocative too. I really cannot say enough about Roble Arkbel as a character. He's just one of the most masterfully written characters in the Final Fantasy series, and he certainly earns his connection to the phenomenal character that is Vivi. The story of Roble Arkbel leads into another one of my favorite references, and that is the final summoning in Final Fantasy X. In the world of that game, summoners must undertake pilgrimages to each of the temples littered around Spira in order to undertake the Cloister of Trials. The reward for completing these trials is the opportunity to pray at the faith of an Aeon, and at the end of the pilgrimage, the summoner obtains the final Aeon, one so powerful it's capable of defeating sin. Summoners perform this final summoning at the cost of their own life in order to defeat sin and usher in a new era of peace to the world. The summoner job from 11 holds a lot of references to summoners in Final Fantasy X. Summoners must journey to the elemental cloisters, which house this game's version of the Aeons. In Vana'diel, a summoner must undertake combat trials also within these cloisters with the deities for the right to summon a significant fraction of their power. These fractions are called avatars. There is a summoning technique known by a few summoners that's called a complete summoning. With a complete summoning, a summoner can call forth the complete power of an avatar, manifesting the deity itself into Vana'diel. This costs the life of the summoner though, just like final summonings in Final Fantasy X. When calling forth an avatar through a complete summoning, the summon is exponentially more powerful than a normal summoning. One of these complete summonings was performed in the Crystal War, and through the power of a single summon, an entire army was rapidly decimated, changing the fate of a hopelessly doomed nation. The Cloud of Darkness is the final boss of Final Fantasy III. This entity threatens the world when the balance between the forces of light and darkness tips too far in either direction. In that game, there is revealed to be an imbalance in the distant past where light flooded the world. The Warriors of Darkness fought against the Cloud of Darkness, who emerged from that resulting imbalance. Towards the end of Final Fantasy III's story, the Warriors of Light must do the same after the balance has shifted too far towards darkness. The Cloud of Darkness also makes an appearance in 11 in Rhapsodies of Vana'diel. Like its counterpart in 3, this entity also appears in any world where the forces of light and darkness aren't balanced. Shortly before the creation of Vana'diel, the deity representing the force of darkness dies. This leaves Vana'diel susceptible to an over-inundation of the light of the Mothercrystals. However, fragments of the Twilight God persists, and so too do the agents that fight for the force of the emptiness. But the imbalance does persist. As a result, the Cloud of Darkness begins seeping through the Mothercrystals and engulfs the entire world. A young girl named Iroha must travel back in time to help the adventurer become the Warrior of Light, to fight against the Warrior of Darkness in order to restore the balance between the two forces. The Cloud of Darkness as a villain explores a huge amount of themes within the 11 lore, and also references a ton of Japanese mythology. While I don't have the time to dive into each of these things, I will say that this depth makes this version of the Cloud of Darkness my personal favorite in the series. On a side note, this rendition of the Warrior of Light is also the most powerful version in the series. While I'm not a big fan of trying to power scale characters across the different games, as far as the strengths of the different Warriors of Light in the main franchise, it's really no comparison. Cait Sith in Final Fantasy VII is an automaton controlled by the executive director of Shinra, Reeve. Cait Sith initially joins the party to spy on them. However, over the course of the story, he begins fighting alongside the party. In one iconic point of the story, Cait Sith sacrifices himself as he's consumed by the shrinking Temple of the Ancients. Despite how tragic this scene is presented, an identical automaton replaces the first Cait Sith, and the sacrifice Cait Sith made inside the temple proves to be inconsequential. The next and only other time Cait Sith returns as a main character in a mainline Final Fantasy story would be in 11's fourth expansion, Wings of the Goddess. In Wings of the Goddess, 10 Cait Sith avatars were created to coordinate with the two agents of Altana to save Vana'diel from the Crystal War. Cait Sith's position as an avatar is also a reference to Final Fantasy VI, which has the first appearance of Cait Sith as a summon. However, there is a huge Final Fantasy VII reference, which happens at an iconic point towards the middle of the expansion story. The adventurer and one of the Cait Sith work together to track down one of the agents of Altana. After an act of betrayal, another one of the Cait Sith facilitates the agent's kidnapping. When the player character and the good Cait Sith are reunited with the kidnapped agent, the enemy summons Atamos to consume all of the good Cait Siths. While their sacrifices seem selfless, they all wind up fusing into one avatar and re-emerging in a really comical scene. The reference doesn't end here though. When Cait Sith is fought as a boss, there are several subtle nods back to the iteration in Final Fantasy VII as well. Despite this reference, Cait Sith in 11 is a huge departure from the version in 7, putting a completely different spin on this character, and the dynamics between this Cait Sith, the agents of Altana, and Atamos are endlessly entertaining. In Final Fantasy VIII, Diablos is the 5th Guardian Force that players can obtain. Cid meets Squall and company as they leave Balamb Garden to head to Timber. He gives them a magical lamp within which Diablos sleeps. When interacted with, the magical lamp will transport players to an alternate dimension to wake up the Guardian Force and fight him. If a player wins, they earn the ability to summon him. In 11, many of the same elements are reused. Diablos bears the title Ruler of Dreams. He's one of the 5 terrestrial avatars and the only one associated with sleep. In preparation for the coming apocalypse, Diablos created an alternate dream reality called Dynamis. Rather than using a magical lamp to enter Dynamis, players must use a special hourglass. Once you're inside Diablos' dream world, there are a plethora of things you can do and play towards. One of these things is fighting Diablos himself. While acquiring him as a summon is done through a different questline, this avatar is an iconic portion of the Dreamworld Dynamis questline. You can also begin work on a relic weapon, the first ultimate weapon type in the game. Despite being an over 20-year-old weapon category, surprisingly, many players still grind for relic weapons today due to their usefulness in modern endgame. Now this reference might seem mild compared to the others on this list, but the reason I like it so much is because of the way this reference has gone on to be used. The relic weapons are a subtle reference back to the relics from Final Fantasy VI. The term relic weapon would also go on to be used in Final Fantasy XIV to denote all of the ultimate weapon categories. Speaking of 14, the term Dynamis is even recycled in 14's lore. Long story short, this one exploration of the Diablos Guardian Force from Final Fantasy VIII has expanded to involve numerous games and lore elements across the series. This also points to a rarely discussed aspect of many of the recent Final Fantasy titles. There have been plenty of Final Fantasy XI references in the recent titles that have gone on to be unnoticed by the majority of players. So the rest of the references on this list will be references in more recent Final Fantasy games back to 11. Final Fantasy XII took an incredible amount of inspiration from 11 in terms of its gameplay loop and combat system. You could say that Final Fantasy XII iterated on 11 in much the same way that any Final Fantasy game iterated on its predecessor before 10. In fact, by the time 14 came out, I wouldn't blame an outside observer for thinking that this was the style and the direction that the Final Fantasy series was headed. As such, 12 has a plethora of reference to 11, but the reference that I found to be the most interesting was a lore-related reference. One of the late-game locations is the ancient city of Girovegan, and deep within this ancient city lies the Great Crystal. This crystal is hypothesized to be the gateway to the world of the Ocuria, a pantheon of powerful beings who shape Ivalice in the way they see fit. This isn't the first time a giant crystal receives that name though. In 11, all of the giant Mothercrystals prove to be shards off the original crystal responsible for all of creation, the Great Crystal. Furthermore, throughout the events of the first two expansions, there is an organization interested in unifying the Mothercrystals to restore the Great Crystal, in a process that they call opening the Gate of the Gods. This organization believed this to be the only way they can reunite with the deities watching over them. Unsurprisingly, in both games, players travel through these crystals for an audience with the powerful beings on the other side. Final Fantasy XI is the first game in the mainline series that establishes extensive explanations and functions for the crystals that had become a staple in the series' debut. As such, it should be no surprise that almost every following Final Fantasy game in the main series would reuse certain aspects of the crystal elements that were established in 11. I had mentioned Mothercrystals a moment ago, and this takes us to the next reference. While the term Mothercrystals makes an appearance in Final Fantasy XIV, it isn't until 16 that we would see a return to form for the Mothercrystals. In that game, Mothercrystals throughout Valisthea are mined in order to harvest smaller crystals that allow normal people to channel Aether into magic. As this takes place, a disease on the land called the Blight begins to spread, forcing all life out of the affected areas. Many people in Valisthea believe the Blight to be a result of the continued mining and destruction of the Mothercrystals. This narrative theme is actually directly borrowed from Chains of Promathia, the second expansion of 11. In 11, the Mothercrystals, as mentioned before, are shards broken off of the original crystal, and they serve as the source of all life in Vana'diel. Endowed within each living being is a fragment of the crystal's light, and with the help of the world trees, the Mothercrystals serve as the source of the live stream, which is also a reference to Final Fantasy VII. Regardless, endowed in every person is also a counterbalancing darkness known as the emptiness. When someone dies, their light returns to the Mothercrystal, and their darkness is likewise released. The released darkness is usually banished by the light of the Mothercrystals though, but the Mothercrystals do weaken over time, and in the Chains of Promathia storyline, this allows the emptiness to aggregate. This aggregation results in certain regions around Vana'diel to be engulfed in the emptiness, and these locations are referred to as the Promethean regions. There are 5 Mothercrystals that players must visit throughout the course of the storyline, and this appears to inspire much of the plot structure of Final Fantasy XVI. Despite their similarities, there are massive departures in how the Mothercrystals are used in both games. This last reference is just as much a gameplay reference as it is a lore reference, and that is Alexander from Final Fantasy XIV. Many players are often taken back by how immersive it is to explore inside Alexander as a dungeon. In the Heavensward MSQ, you learn that Alexander is a primal, and you learn about its uniqueness as a primal through its own questline. Exploring Alexander comes to a crescendo in the Epic of Alexander, an ultimate raid where players get the privilege of fighting the hardest variant of the superboss Alexander, inside Alexander, summoned by Alexander. This isn't the first time the series has seen this sort of encounter though. Many of these elements were references to Alexander's appearance in Final Fantasy XI. In Final Fantasy XI, Alexander and Odin fought in a battle known as Ragnarok, several hundred years before the events of the game. In Treasures of Ottergon, players get to explore inside the massive labyrinthine corpse of Alexander's body. There are plenty of things to do here, including the Acquisition questline for the game's second ultimate weapon type, but the reason Alexander is on this list is because of the third ultimate raid of Final Fantasy XIV, which references the first ever Master Trial in 11, Black and White. In this encounter, players must fight against Alexander, inhabiting Alexander, inside Alexander. For those who don't know, Master Trials in 11 are the precursor to Ultimate Raids in Final Fantasy XIV, serving as the most difficult content for their gear level. They also only reward aesthetic weapons too. Admittedly, these fights do have key differences. In the Epic of Alexander, the Primal is the only opponent the players have to fight, but in Black and White, Alexander is accompanied by Odin and several other mobs. These references are only scratching the surface of the references that 11 has with the broader Final Fantasy series. There are so many more I could list and discuss, but throughout my time playing 11, these are the references that stuck out to me the most. I felt compelled to finish this script and make this video after seeing that this channel has hit 2,000 subscribers. This is still bizarre to think about. Back when I decided to do a series on 11, I wasn't expecting any viewership. But at the time of making this video, my retrospective series has over 60,000 views, with my new player videos just shy of 100,000 combined views. Thank you for enjoying those videos, and I hope you enjoyed this one.